Welcome to my channel. My name is Taylor Isaac, and in this video we're going to be talking about how a woman can help a man heal through his bond with her. This video is divided into 3 sections: the cage, the test, and the freedom. It's an epic journey, so let's dig in. A few years ago, I came across a fascinating talk on the topic of addiction. The speaker was a man called Johann Hari, a journalist who, like so many others, had addicts in his life, people he loved and who he wanted to help. So he embarked on a journey across the world to meet the foremost experts on the topic. He met a man named Bruce Alexander, a psychology professor in Vancouver, who explained that what most people think today about addiction comes from a series of experiments conducted earlier in the 20th century. The experiment was simple and heartbreaking. Take a rat, put it in a cage with 2 bottles, one with water and one laced with an addictive substance. Researchers quickly discovered that the rat almost always preferred the substance bottle, and it almost always quickly led to death. This caused researchers to conclude, well, there you have it. When given the choice, even to death, once an addictive substance gets its chemical hooks in, a rat or addict becomes powerless to its addictive effects. And that's the end of the story. But that wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was Professor Alexander who discovered that the initial experiment had a huge flaw in its design. The rats were in an empty cage with nothing to do except the substance. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park. It was basically a heaven for rats. They have loads of cheese, loads of colored balls, loads of tunnels, and most importantly, loads of friends. And they have both water bottles, normal water and the substance. What happened next was fascinating. In Rat Park, researchers discovered that the rats rarely used the substance bottle, not compulsively and never to death. Suddenly, these rats who would almost always overdose when they were alone in an empty cage stopped once they were in their little slice of heaven, living content and connected lives. Professor Alexander began to think that there was more to this story of addiction. He said, what if addiction isn't about your chemical hooks? What if addiction is about your cage? What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Back on his journey, Hari met another professor by the name of Peter Cohen in the Netherlands. Cohen said, maybe we shouldn't even call it addiction. Maybe we should call it bonding. Human beings have the natural and innate need to bond. And when we're happy and healthy, we'll do that with others. But if you can't do that because you're traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you a sense of relief. Hari began to believe that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. So what do cages and adaptations and bonding and addictions have to do with a woman helping a man heal? Well, a lot actually. But in order to understand why, we need to take a turn about a psychotherapeutic treatment process called control mastery theory, which takes the concept of adaptation one step further. This theory was proposed by a psychoanalyst by the name of Dr. Joseph Weiss, after he discovered people he was treating had spontaneous insights into their concerns during sessions without the aid of his interpretation. He began to realize that the curative element of therapy may not be what we commonly think it is. It isn't necessarily people talking about their problems and getting the interpretation of the therapist. It isn't even people seeking out the solutions to their problems. So what is it? In a guide by a man called Dr. Alan Rappaport on this process, he explains that the theory proposes that people's most powerful motivation is to adapt to the real world. In service of this motivation, they create cognitive constructs, consciously and unconsciously based on their experiences and which guide their behavior. These are our beliefs and our worldviews that tell us who we are, and how the world is. But when people create incorrect constructs, those which are inferred from traumatic experiences, those are referred to as pathogenic beliefs or pathogenic adaptations. They are, in essence, an adaptation to a toxic experience or cage. For example, a child who grew up around rejecting parents may incorrectly infer that she deserves rejection and therefore lives her life accepting rejection or not even being willing to put herself out there because her adaptation of being worthy of rejection tells her it's not safe to do so. Another example is a child who is raised around overbearing parents who may incorrectly infer that if he were to pursue his independence to the fullest extent, he would be harming his parents and lose a relationship with them. According to this theory, people suffer from these adaptations and are therefore in intrinsically motivated to overcome them. But in order to do so, they must determine that the dangers predicted by the adaptations will not occur, and that it is safe to pursue their goals, that it is safe to exit the cage. Dr. Rappaport explains that in life and in psychotherapy, people wish to find the safety they need to relinquish their pathogenic adaptations and will test their environment in search of this safety to do so to the extent that their beliefs allow them to. Control mastery theory holds that the reason why people enter therapy is in order to test the continued necessity for their pathogenic adaptations against reality and in a relationship with a therapist. Dr. Weiss realized that it was this testing process itself in relationship to a safe person that was the curative element of the psychotherapeutic process. In other words, it wasn't the therapist who was coming up with a solution, rather it was the patient himself who allowed the solution to surface as a natural response to the safety to do so. He released his adaptations and moved toward a more accurate and authentic way of being. So what does this have to do with women helping men heal? Since most of us have grown up in a pretty toxic society, especially when it comes to the relationships between men and women and relationships in general, this process of testing is pretty much expected. For many of us, when we enter into a healthy relationship, we go through a period of testing. Now, this isn't the toxic testing where one person is trying to test the other person. This is largely unconscious, and the desire behind it is to become more of who we are in order to release our own adaptations and to soften into the safety of a loving connection. But if we don't know that this testing process is part of the process of healing and growth, we may react against it or shut it down rather than helping ourselves and our partners through it, which brings us to our next part. But first, what I share next is not about a woman trying to diagnose a man or act like his therapist. It's not even about a man needing to talk about his past trauma. On to the practical tips. Okay, in this section, we're going to get into the deeper hows. If I were to sum this up, it would be women, be a safe space for your men. But that doesn't really tell us much. So we need to understand the how. How can we be a safe space for our men to allow them to release their trauma? And if you're a man watching this may help you men to personalize it more to your experience. Let's dig in. There are really 3 ways that I observed this adaptation and trauma in my marriage. My husband and I have a really interesting story. We met, and 3 months later, he asked me to marry him. Not so typical these days, and yet here we are. We will be married 9 years this year. This is something I lived through and walked through before I even knew the sort of psychological theory behind it. So the 3 things that showed up in my marriage were anger, a general discomfort and anxiety, and addictions. These addictions are not overwhelming, life-consuming addictions. These are more of like the escapism, numbing yourself sort of things. Number 1, anger. What I noticed in the beginning of my marriage with my husband is that whenever we would get into arguments, his anger could flare up pretty easily. And I remember feeling like, okay, why is he getting angry? It doesn't seem to relate to what we're talking about. Like, it just doesn't seem like an appropriate response. What I discovered is he was getting angry in anticipation to be unheard, misunderstood, or misrepresented. So what is the difference between these 3? Being unheard means that your partner doesn't even want to hear you. They're not even open to a dialogue with you. Being misunderstood is when your partner cannot see your point. They can't see where you're coming from, right? They can't understand your point of view. And the third thing is being misrepresented. And that is when your partner takes what you're saying and twists it. All of these things are anger inducing. My husband, he had dated people before me, and he has his own experience. Because of that, when we got together, he was anticipating that I was going to treat him the same way. Here's how I sort of navigated that. So what usually happens in a situation like this is that when a man's anger flares up, a woman's natural instinct is to smack him down. Right? Emasculate him, deflate him, to try to equalize that pressure and that power, because men are naturally so much more powerful than women physically, that women try to equalize the power by cutting them down. A woman might say things like, why are you getting angry about this? Like, you need to calm down. You shouldn't be upset about this. So many women might think that they shouldn't be angry because they can't connect that anger with what's happening in the moment. But that anger is not coming from nowhere. It's coming from somewhere in particular and somewhere important. And once you can start to recognize that it's preemptive, it's an adaptation to ways they've been disrespected in the past, then you can sort of take a different tack to help them to release that. As the old saying goes, use it or lose it. Once man doesn't have to use that anymore, it will naturally fall away, and it's a beautiful thing. So what can you do to help this process along? Here's what I did. I would say things like, I'm with you. I'm on your side. I want to hear you. I want us to get closer. I want to hear what you have to say. And something that's really important here is that, women will want to get away from that pressure, which is an absolutely normal response. But if you can sort of stay and face him and not abandon, not leave, not walk away, face him, speak those calming words, let him know you're on his side, let him know that he's going to be heard, he's not going to be misunderstood, and he's not going to be misrepresented. The more that happens, eventually all of that whole thing will just go away. When you stand in opposition to that, when you stand to show that that may have happened to you before, but that is not me and that's not going to happen now, the more that you can do that, the more he will let that go. It just won't happen anymore. Okay. So the second thing is anxiety and discomfort. How this showed up in my marriage is that my husband used to get really uncomfortable anytime he was working on something, whether he was, trying to clean something, he was cooking something, or he was tinkering with something. He would get uncomfortable if he felt like I was watching him. And what I realized is that this was a preemptive response to judgment, for criticism, and being held to someone else's ruler. Many men today hear lots of criticism, lots of women sort of interrupting them and being like, oh, I would do it this way. So what a woman might typically do is say, I'm not doing that to you. Why do you think I'm always judging you? Focusing on what they are doing or not doing. But if you want to help your man release this, this is what I did. So I would say things like, oh, I'm just coming to see what you're doing. I'm not judging you. I'm not really paying attention to you. I just wanted to come see what you're up to. Stuff like that over time. That, and also not trying to change his course, not trying to insert yourself into what he's doing, knowing that we do not hold the rulers in our relationship, that our partner has the absolute, capacity to do his own thing, to make his own decisions. Another thing that I utilize in this sort of situation is something I learned from a woman called Allison Armstrong. I'll link her stuff below, but she says that all men are planners. They make plans, right? They plan, right? They have a plan. So you can just assume that if a man is doing something, it's because he's already thought it out and made a plan for it. So if you go in and interrupt him, he's going to get frustrated. But if you can approach him and say, oh, what's your plan here? You're probably going to get a much better outcome. And the more that we show him that we're not judging him, we're not critiquing him, all of that stuff will disappear. It doesn't need to come up anymore. Okay. And the last thing is addictions. Like I said before, these aren't all consuming addictions. This is not your partner becoming an addict. This is more like addictive behaviors that get in the way of them achieving some sort of goal. So let's say your partner's talked about writing a book, or wanting to go to the gym, or wanting to do, achieve something, but they just want to drink, or they want to whatever sort of escapism or numbing stuff. Oftentimes it means that he is struggling or stressed out with something. Maybe he doesn't really know what it is, and maybe he doesn't know how to get out of it. So oftentimes women will say things like, if you loved me, you wouldn't be doing this. But the thing about that is it's really not compelling, because unless she created the problem, she's not going to cure the problem. What I found that works instead is if you can try to create an environment in which the solution is easy, it's much easier to take that route. What do I mean by this? So first thing, you can say something like, listen, I don't want you to be a slave to this. I don't want you to be stuck in this habit. I don't want you to be wasting your time in this way, because it's about believing in him, not focusing on the problem, not focusing on the issue, but focusing on him, believing in him, successful to overcome this and to achieve. And so you can help create an environment that enables him to do that. Let's say that your husband talked about writing a book. What does he need to write that book? Maybe he needs hours after work of uninterrupted time. Maybe he's talked about wanting to go to the gym more. So what does he need? Maybe he needs to be able to go to the gym and not feel like you're counting down the time for him to get home, or not feel like all of these other things are yelling at him for his time and his attention. He needs to be able to focus on achieving that thing without strings attached. So men will often try to avoid extra work. They don't want to have to deal with more work or conflict or disharmony. So they will put off doing the things that they really want to do in order to avoid those things. So what we can do is make it easy for him to go towards those goals. At the end of the day, it's really about that it's safe for them to be who they are. The more that we can demonstrate that to them, the more of those anticipation adaptations will just fall away, and you will find more harmony and stability and joy naturally grows within your relationship.